Gary Opit is an environmental consultant with 30 years of in-the-field work as a wildlife specialist. As a cryptozoologist, he's one of Australia's most highly regarded researchers of yowies and other mysterious cryptids in Australia, Papua New Guinea and Southeast Asia. Gary knows the sounds of all manner of animals in the wild, but he's seen and heard some that he knows just don't fit the bill of known species. Hi Gary, and welcome to Ghost Radio.
Hello, how do you do? Glad to meet you. Glad to be on Ghost Radio.
Well, I understand that you've got 30 years of being in the field. You really must get to know the sounds of the wild pretty well over that time.
Yes, that's correct. And for the last 10 years I've been broadcasting wildlife talkbacks on ABC North Coast New South Wales Radio, and I have to identify all species of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, insects from listeners' descriptions of the animals they're seeing in their gardens or in the bush, and identification of calls. And I've been able to identify every single call and an animal, because that's part of my work. I have to be able to go out into the field and identify the animals that live in a particular habitat, and more often than not you only hear the animals. Some species, of course, like birds, you see them quite easily, but other animals you have to determine from their traces, diggings, tree scratches, etc.
Was it through being out in the wild and hearing something that you couldn't identify that sort of surprised you, that made you become a cryptozoologist?
I was always interested in cryptozoology, in these remarkable reports of unknown animals and lake monsters and yetis and things like that. And being always interested in the natural environment, it sounded to me like these could well be descriptions of a highly endangered species existing in remnant populations. And so I was quite fascinated, but I never imagined for a moment that there was anything unknown in Australia. And like most biologists and naturalists, I was positive that everything had been found long ago and there was no chance of anything unusual existing. And so when I actually began to hear calls that I couldn't identify and actually even observe unidentified animals, then I began to realise that there was more to the bushland than meets the eye.
But that's quite a common opinion of people. We think that, because we're human beings and we're so damn clever, that we know absolutely every creature that's walking around on the planet.
Yes, that's correct. We fail to realise that much of the natural habitat existing today is in very remote and often inaccessible landscapes, mountain ranges and deserts, and places that people don't frequent. And so it comes as no surprise really when we find a whole array of new species of animals not long ago described from the rainforests of Vietnam. Various species of ox and antelope, tortoise, monkeys, and also descriptions of once again a yeti or Bigfoot-like animal, some sort of an unknown primate, also in the Vietnamese rainforest in the mountainous regions.
Yeah, the descriptions are very similar to the Sasquatch and the Yowie, except they just call them by a different name, like the Forest Man or the Briar or the Noi Rung.
Yes, that's correct, because every culture has had their own names for these animals, and of course that's some of the most important evidence to show that these things exist, because it's highly unlikely that us Westerners could be tracking down animals that the Aboriginal people in all these different countries wouldn't be very well familiar with. And so if, say, the Aboriginal people or the Vietnamese people or the American Indians or the Nepalese or whoever, Tibetans, didn't have any names for these animals, then we could be certain that they didn't exist. And so all of these cryptozoological mysteries begin with reports from native peoples, the natural inhabitants of a landscape, and their descriptions are very detailed, and they know their calls. But of course, what would often happen would be that Western scientists would arrive and would refuse to believe that the local people could possibly know something that they didn't know.
I know that one of the big questions that comes up with zoologists and biologists is, well, in order for these creatures to exist, there has to be quite a large breeding population. So how many of them do we need in order for them to sustain their species?
It's generally believed that you need a minimum of 500 individuals to reproduce successfully. However, some species have been reduced to maybe only 100 individuals, things like the Indian rhinoceros, the Javan rhinoceros, the Sumatran rhinoceros, which is also in Borneo. These are animals that are down to populations of 100 or less, maybe more. And genetic studies of the Indian rhinoceros, for instance, found that even though at one time there was only about 100 individuals, there's now about 600 or 700, perhaps more today, with protection. Their numbers have increased. The examination of their genetics found that they had very diverse genetics. So, see, we're looking at species that have been around for millions of years and have, dominated their environments. They've got a very diverse gene pools. And then, of course, with the rise of modern humanity, especially Aboriginal people, the natural inhabitants of every landscape, hunting with domesticated dogs, forming a very formidable hunting team, they are able to reduce populations of wild animals all over the world, often to very low numbers, often even the extinction occurring of many species. And so it's only natural that the few species that have managed to hang on would be things like these yowies, which would be somewhat intelligent and nocturnal, cryptic animals, and can hang on to the present. And of course, when a population is reduced, say like the Tasmanian tiger or thylacine, remember what occurs is that we take out all of the individuals that were the dominant members of the population, are the ones that in the best habitat. And I think it's very likely that there was, in these situations, there's also a subpopulation of animals that may not ever have been able to take the prime habitats and were always forced to take the suboptimal habitats and had to be cryptic, not just to protect themselves from, say, humans, but even to protect themselves from more dominant, aggressive members of their own population.
Well, they'd have to be pretty good at hiding if they're going to sustain their species.
That's right, and I think what happened in Australia, I think that the Aboriginal dingo hunting group managed to eliminate some of these species that we're hearing about today to very low levels, so that they were virtually on the edge of extinction and surviving in poor habitat and under constant threat from Aboriginal hunters, of course. And then after the Aboriginal people and the dingoes' numbers were reduced by white settlement, massacres and all kinds of things that went on, it provided an opportunity for a lot of species to increase in numbers. And so we had great increases in the populations of kangaroos and koalas, for instance, once they were released from the heavy hunting pressure of Aboriginal people and dingoes. And so I think similar things happen with things like these yowies and also the thylacine and other mystery animals in Australia. I think there's populations of maybe 500 or 600 or maybe 1,000, but with large territories. Most of these things all about these things we're talking about, they're carnivores. And something like the Siberian tiger, apparently you'd only get about 200 200 tigers in, say, an area the size of Tasmania. So we might have a similar situation with things like thylacines and yowies, where you have nocturnal predators that have very large hunting territories, perhaps definitely scores of square kilometres probably.
I was going to ask you before, how many do you think are out there, but you've answered that. But is Queensland the hotspot in Australia for the yowie?
Yes, Queensland and New South Wales, particularly Queensland, because Queensland has a lot of mountain ranges, and remember the Queensland population has been increasing, human population increasing quite rapidly over the last 20 or 30 years, but a very large state and a lot of very wild, undisturbed habitat, or relatively undisturbed habitat. I'm thinking, of course, particularly about northern Australia, where there's been also many Yowie reports from North Queensland, Cape York Peninsula, Opit and Tablelands, and you've got a variety of remote areas, and plant species are being found. Various small animal species are being found from time to time. And so it seems only natural that if Aboriginal people had descriptions of these animals, and Europeans or Westerners, modern Westerners, have been seeing and hearing similar things, then it all fits into the normal pattern.
What is the classic description of a Yowie?
A Yowie is generally it's a primate. It's like an ape, but it's more like a bipedal ape in that it's very gorilla-like. It's quite heavily built, and but the face is generally very human-like, virtually with no chin. The eyes are deeply set and large and dark, and they've got very good nocturnal vision. If you flash a torch onto them, their eyes shine very brightly with a bright red reflecting light, just like many other animals.
Okay.
And a very large body frame covered with a generally long brownish hair. It can be almost black, or it can be a brownish red. And a very man-like shape, and very large hands. Often the feet have quite broad. They leave quite a broad footprint, and they can have quite long, powerful-looking toes. And the interesting thing is that they're generally observed to be bipedal, moving on two legs, but they do drop down and knuckle walk. They walk on all fours, just like a gorilla and a chimpanzee. Their face is usually brown to black, and it's not so gorilla-like as it looks a little bit more. People that have had a good close look say that it's halfway between an ape and a man.
How about smell?
They've got a very strong smell. However, I don't know if that's if they use flatulence, say, as some sort of as a warning or a defensive mechanism or whatever. But people generally record the observation that there's a very distinctive odour, a very animal odour. You know, some of the descriptions is a mixture of something like feces and urine. And I suppose if you were to go and sniff a gorilla in a zoo or something like that, you'd probably notice a bit of an odour, and an animal that's in its natural habitat and away from, you know, the clean surrounds of a zoo where they're being cleaned and washed and fed and everything. Perhaps they may have a stronger odour, though I would imagine that if they had too strong an odour, it wouldn't help while they're hunting.
Because there's a lot of reports in America with the Sasquatch that it smells pretty bad, and in fact there's the skunk ape in Florida that is apparently extremely pungent.
Yes. See, one of the very interesting aspects of the phenomena is that you get this similarity right across the planet, say in distant places such as North America and in Australia, and I believe the same also in Asia, that these animals have a very strong smell, a very distinctive smell. Of course, us humans, we're actually very adapted to fragrances and smells and stuff. I mean, in our normal day-to-day life, we're actually probably using our olfactory senses more than we realise, and so we know what things smell like. We're actually using our sense of smell. So if you come across something with a completely different smell, then you're immediately aware of it, because it's part of our survival to be able to determine what's in our environment, and that we did that as well as by listening and watching, but also by scenting the air.
There's a reasonable amount of conjecture as to what it actually is. A lot of people suspect that it might be a Gigantopithecus blackie, and other people think that it could be a Homo erectus. Where do you stand on this debate?
Look, the one that I saw in New Guinea, I would say it was so man-like that I'd have to go for Homo erectus. However, it's possible that we have more than a single species. In fact, in Australia, we know that we have two different species, and I've heard both their calls, their territorial calls, and they're quite distinctive. And one's only half the size as the other. So I've got one species. The males are larger than the females generally, and the one species stands around about 2.5 metres tall. The smaller species, generally known as Junjuddy, stands only about 1.5 metres tall.
So that's a pretty big difference.
Yes, a major difference, and that's fairly normal in the natural world. When you have similar species, closely related species, inhabiting and competing for similar resources, for similar food, then you do get an ecological situation where you'll get one species half the size of the other species, so that you lessen competition between the species for the resources in their natural habitat.
Do you think they travel in groups, or are they solitary nocturnal creatures?
No, I think they probably live in small family groups. Basically, I think you get male-female relationships with maybe one or two young, and a bit like humans, I think they have probably long gestation periods, long childhoods. The infant remains a long time with the adult. I think they're naturally slow breeding, that they reproduce very slowly, and they're naturally cryptic, and they're primarily carnivores. If they were more herbivorous, we would find a lot more evidence of them defecating. And imagine a bird like a cassowary or something that's going around eating rainforest fruit, for instance. Well, they leave their droppings there, quite distinctive on the ground. But a carnivore would be less visible. It'd be much more a cunning animal, and also a lot less active. If it's a carnivorous animals are relatively inactive compared to herbivorous animals, so like a fruit-eating animal like an orangutan or something, is moving around in the forest, finding its resources, its foods, fruits, but a carnivore would only need to eat occasionally because they've got a high-protein diet. They'd be expert hunters, and I think they'd be very lethargic. I think they'd spend majority of their time just taking it easy in the safest and remotest part of their habitat.
Gary, I was just going to ask you, have you found any evidence out in the wild throughout your years in the field of creatures like the Yowie?
The only time I found evidence was in that same locality where that recording was made of the Yowie howling.
Yeah.
And the Yowie trackers, a group of people who are just interested in bushwalking and camping in the bush, began to notice that something had been taking the widgety grubs, moth larvae and beetle larvae out of the base of small trees. And they asked me if I would come and have a look and tell them what was responsible. I said it was almost certainly black cockatoos. But they said, oh no, they haven't seen any black cockatoos, and all of this feeding behaviour is taking place at the base of the trees. So I thought, well, it's a good, interesting opportunity to go and have a look. So I camped out with them, and I spent a couple of days having a look. And sure enough, I found in my mind, the most convincing evidence that these animals exist, because an unknown animal was feeding in a very precise way on these beetle larvae in the base of green wattles. And these wattle trees, they're only about, the thickest ones would be maybe 20 or 25, 30 centimetres in diameter, and stand 5 or 6 metres high. And virtually every single one of these trees in quite a large area that I examined over a couple of days had beetle larvae extracted from near the base of the tree, and there was no evidence of teeth or beak marks whatsoever. Whatever was feeding on these wickety grubs hadn't been using beaks or teeth, and it was using what I would imagine its thumbnail, but up and down the tree, there were very distinct impressions of what looked like a large flat thumb, as if it had been poking it into the bark and perhaps listening to the movement of the wickety grub, and then it would pierce the bark with its thumbnail and peel down a strip of bark around about 12 or 15 centimetres long, and then it would chip out from the top down 3 or 4 or 5 pieces of timber and expose the burrow of the beetle larvae, and then it must use its fingernail to extract the larvae out of its burrow, because there was no damage to the sides of the burrow, or the top of the burrow, where it had been exposed by pulling up the chip of wood. And that was the same feeding habit going on right throughout the whole locality, and I'd never seen anything like that before.
It sounds like they have a high level of wilderness intelligence.
Yes, well, to these, I mean, like any other natural inhabitant of the bushland, they're well and truly adapted to surviving on the resources available, and of course they're highly efficient animals. I mean, they're not wasting resources. They're not like humans. They're particularly careful with their feeding, because they had to survive in a particular territory for long periods of time.
Have you come across any convincing footprints?
I haven't. I mean, I've seen the plaster casts of footprints. I myself have never come across footprints, and I'm always looking, because I identify animals from their footprints.
Yeah.
And I haven't come across footprints myself, but just the other day I was camping out in the Condamine Gorge, southeast Queensland, and I was very fascinated to find a place where it looked like a feeding site. A cow, the remains of a cow, the bones of a cow were scattered about, which is nothing unusual, but what was very interesting was that every single one of these bones, particularly all the limb bones, all the large elongated bones, had all been broken in half, as if something was after the marrow, and there was no large bones left. They'd all been broken into small pieces, which is something I'd never seen before, and these were big, strong bones. And in that same area, I noticed several small sapling eucalyptus trees had been pushed over, and they were much too strong for a person to push over, and they couldn't have been pushed over by cattle or by wind or anything. And yet they were lying flat on the ground. These are, once again, small trees about 5 or 6 metres high and maybe a diameter of about 10 or 15, 20 centimetres in diameter. And they'd been pushed downhill, but I'm not quite sure why. But that was very unusual. Also, rocks lying around on top of the grass. So something had been dislodging rocks as if looking for insects. And I have actually found once an area of kangaroo grass that was dead in the forest, and I was thinking, what on earth killed all this kangaroo grass? And I found that every single one of those strong tufts of grass had been pulled up from the roots and then set back down again, as if something had been hunting for insect larvae. And the only other interesting thing I found up in Cape York once, and also on Tambourine, was where a small palm tree had the fronds. This is a palm tree only a couple of metres high or less. Had the fronds broken back and weaved in amongst itself. Very unusual. These were in very remote places where there's no people around, and I couldn't bend those palm fronds back myself. And there was no cattle or anything in these areas, and so that's another bit of evidence. But it's the calls that really made me believe that we were dealing with some remarkably unknown primate.
Just going back to the cow carcass that you found,
yes.
Obviously we have no natural predators in Australia that would do that sort of a thing, correct?
Yes.
Could it possibly be pumas, like, mysterious black cats?
Well, something like that would gnaw, say, the bones, perhaps, or gnaw the meat at least off the bones. But no, these bones are all broken. All the leg bones had all been snapped in half or smashed in half with. It looked like to me like they'd been smashed in with half with a rock. So yeah, no, I was very surprised to find that, and as well as that, I was hearing very powerful calls both during the evening and the next morning. Some of which sounded like the call that was recorded up at Jimna, a sort of dingo-like howl, but you can tell it's not a dingo because it's got a more of a guttural sort of quality to it, and also some very, very powerful sort of woof, woof sort of calls.
Well, we've actually got a bit of a call that that you've sent us that we can play for people now, so we'll just have a quick listen.
Okay.
It's really interesting, that Yowie call that you just played us. Where was that recorded?
That was recorded in an area called Jimna, just north of Brisbane, southeast Queensland, and recorded by some people that I've been in touch with. They call themselves the Yowie Trackers. There was also the Yowie Hunters, some ordinary Australians that are become very enthusiastic about trying to determine exactly what's behind the mysterious calls that they've heard when they've been out camping. It's quite a different call to the sound of the dingo, which has that wonderful wolf-like howl. It's a much deeper call, as if it comes from a much larger, sort of heavy-chested animal.
It sounds very guttural.
Yes. And that's typical of their calls. I've heard quite a range of Yowie calls over the years, both in New Guinea and on east coast of Australia, southeast Queensland, northeast New South Wales.
Okay, well listen, I'll play you this call. It was a call of a Sasquatch. I believe it was recorded in Washington State, and I think it's got a couple of similarities to what we just heard with the Yowie. So have a listen to this and tell me what you think.
Righto.
What did you think of that?
Oh, the first part of the call, very, very similar.
Yeah.
Very similar. That's that. That's that very typical guttural, powerful voice. And no other animal has a voice quite like that.
It's quite haunting.
Yes. A very spooky thing to hear when you're out in the forest.
I think also a bit of a frightening thing to hear when you're out in the forest.
Well, if you're not used to wildlife, it is. I'm not concerned at all. I've spent many, many years undertaking fauna and flora surveys in very remote places. And so I'm not concerned, but one has to be careful with them. They have been known to throw rocks at people, and if they're aggressive, they will chase you out of their habitat. But if you try to chase them down, they'll generally run for their life. They're very shy.
We'll just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a moment with Gary Opit on Ghost Radio.
Nobody does it better than Ghost Radio Network. This is Kevin Smith. Join me live daily right here.
The Greys, the Reptilians, praying menace beings, and Area 51 employees.
What the hell?
What do they all have in common? They listen to Ghost Radio. Come on over to the other side and prepare to be assimilated.
The idea is to keep the green alien landing craft from taking your humans from the ground and changing them into mutants. A mutant is very dangerous to you because he flies faster than you do and shoots at you.
Gary, so could you just describe to me the kinds of things that you've experienced with the calls?
Well, the first time I heard these calls was in 73 and 74 in Papua New Guinea in the rainforest, where I was studying the wildlife with biologists from the Wow Ecology Institute, a field station at the Bishop Museum of Hawaii. And we were mainly working at an elevation of about 1,500 metres on the slopes of Mount Missum in undisturbed Castanopsis oak rainforest, a place called Poverty Creek. And I was recording the wildlife, and I was very surprised that on several occasions in December, on the 6th, the 14th and 19th of December 73 and the 16th and 20th of October 74 during daylight hours, I had very loud and powerful mammal-like calls consisting of a series of like deep bass notes repeated without variation over maybe 5 seconds, sort of a bellowing roar, and maybe coming from a kilometre away. And I was very amazed, and because no such calls should be heard in the New Guinean rainforests. And
because they only have small primates, is that correct?
They don't have any primates.
No primates.
New Guinea is part of the Australasian faunal assemblage, so they have the same animals that we have in Australia, or lots of similar ones to North Queensland. So they have various species of possums and tree kangaroos, cuscusses, cassowaries, but they also have, of course, wild pigs, just like North Queensland, and of course bower birds and birds of paradise, a fantastic array of parrots and pigeons, and it was particularly the birds that I was concentrating on because they were the easiest things to find. And they've got small carnivorous marsupials like our northern quoll, and of course things like long-beaked echidnas related to our short-beaked echidnas. But there was nothing in those forests that could make sounds like that I was hearing, and they sounded very primate-like, and there was nothing like any of the calls, the primate calls that I'd known, because I've always been a great one to visit zoos and spend days there listening to the calls of all the different apes, for instance.
Did the people that you were with find those sorts of calls unique in New Guinea?
Yes, they were perplexed about them, but because one fellow was an ornithologist, another fellow was a herpetologist, and the others were botanists, and so they weren't mammalogists, and so they couldn't really come to any conclusion as to what the sounds were, what the animal was that was responsible. And of course I couldn't as well. I mean, it was something that we shouldn't have been hearing. But I was forced to the opinion that we had some kind of unknown primate, large, powerful unknown primate. And I found that thought very disturbing because I'd heard about Bigfoot in North America and Yetis in the Himalayas, but I didn't think there was any chance of anything like that living in a place like New Guinea. And I hadn't heard of any such thing in Australia either. And then I did get to see a sort of a dark bipedal figure crossing the track about 200 metres in front of me.
Well, that's pretty close.
And yes, and I was very surprised. I took it to be a person, of course, because its walk and everything about it was very human-like. It just looked like a person. It was very dark. It wasn't shaggy fur, so if it was covered in fur, I couldn't tell. All I could see this dark figure crossing in front of me. But what surprised me, of course, was that I was in a very remote, high-altitude, cold environment, and up in the mountains, and the New Guineans, of course, tended to live in the valleys, and they always wore clothes of some kind, even if they were just wearing their traditional clothes. They always carried weapons with them. They never moved around by themselves, and they just kept to the tracks. And this figure crossed the track. It was a logging track, so I got a good look at it. Crossed the logging track. It didn't look up or down the track at all. It didn't notice me, and I realised that it was sneaking up onto an ornithologist colleague who was sitting in a bird hide watching a nesting fruit pigeons. And so it was a great mystery to me what on earth that figure was.
Did the ornithologist
would be wandering around up there by themselves and not having to do with the track and why they'd be sneaking up?
Did the ornithologist see it too?
No, he saw nothing. When I got up to him, I said to him, "Who's your mate? who's the person that's been wandering around here? And he said, well, I didn't see anything. And I said, you must have. Someone was heading straight towards your hide. He looked like he was sneaking up on you. And he said, no, it couldn't have been. I never saw anything. But he was looking downhill at this, watching these birds on this nest. And this figure was sneaking up behind him, coming down the slope. So, he never saw anything.
You've also seen another interesting creature in Papua New Guinea, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that after this short break.
Good day.
Gary, could you tell me a little bit about this creature that you saw in New Guinea that the locals were calling Mermaid?
Yes, that was another astounding thing. I was around about that same time. I was on a coastal steamer, one of the small cargo vessels. This is in 1973, sailing along the coast between Madang, on the north coast of New Guinea, between Madang and Madang and Wewak. And of course, being mad on wildlife, I'd spend every moment observing the surface of the ocean, of watching frigate birds. And I'd see sharks occasionally, and spinner dolphins spinning out of the water, sea turtles, and of course terns, and other birds, and occasionally manta rays. And then I was surprised to see a rounded head on the surface, a dark rounded head on the surface of the ocean, right in front of the vessel. I was standing near the bow, and it pulled its head down into the water. And the water was crystal clear, and within a few seconds we were travelling over this animal, and it was descending tail first. And I could see a distinct head, a rounded sort of head. It was dark in colour, and a sort of a body and a tail, and it was sinking tail first down into the water. Now I took that to be a dugong, because I'd seen pictures of dugongs feeding their young sitting at the surface of the ocean.
Yeah.
And so I thought that had to be a dugong. But years afterwards, when I actually got to see dugongs don't act anything like this animal. They have quite a head that's almost like it's a bit different related to elephants. They've got a head that's sort of maybe shaped a little bit like a small hippopotamus. And they don't sit with their heads sticking above the water, and they don't descend tail first. They just move like a dolphin. They come to the surface and sound. But anyway, I took that animal to be a dugong, because I'd never seen a dugong previously. And then I was talking to one of the elders. I was always talking with the natives, asking them, what animals they had seen, and talking about their culture. I kept detailed notes, and this elderly man was going through all the animals that he knew of, and because I was after interested in things like bowerbirds and birds of paradise and tree kangaroos and things, and he told me about this animal that they had hauled up in a fishing net.
Yeah.
And he described it as black and having the body of a woman and the bottom half of like a dolphin. And of course I just started laughing at him immediately.
Right.
I said, that's a mermaid. No such thing could possibly exist. And he got quite upset at me, and he was saying, no, we caught this, we dragged it up in the net, and we're absolutely amazed. We're looking at it, and had eyes a bit like a dolphin, and we were so scared and so amazed that we immediately returned it back to the sea. So I mean, I just found this too astounding. I couldn't believe for 1 second that there was any such thing as a mermaid until I received a journal of the International Society of Cryptozoologists about expeditions in New Guinea looking for the ree or mermaid, and they described exactly the same animal, and it turned out that this animal was known quite well in certain places, including New Britain. And I'd travelled through New Britain and New Ireland, but I had never asked if people had seen mermaids. mermaids, I wouldn't even
Sure.
think to ask them such a thing. And then, of course, that made me think, oh, my goodness, that animal that I saw resembles very closely the description of these rees. And then I also encountered in a very interesting book, it's called The Field Guide to Bigfoot Yeti and Other Mystery Primates Worldwide by Lauren Coleman and Patrick Huey. And I was absolutely astounded to read of a mermaid being caught in the Morotai Islands, in the northernmost islands of the Halmahera group in Indonesia, which was just to the west of where I had this sighting. And they described, it was a US Navy man by the name of Ryan Mallard, actually observed the native fishermen dragging this remarkable thing up in a net, and he took it at first to be a shark, and 1 minute it seemed human, the next it looked like a 7-foot-long shark, and when he asked the natives what it was, they said, we've caught another mermaid, and he wanted to make the natives let it go, but they said, oh no, we'll not kill it, it'll just die itself. And they dragged it up onto the sand, tangled in the net, and they tried to escape for about half an hour.
How could it escape if it's got a tail?
And it was struggling to escape, get away from the net that it was entangled in, and he describes it as being that the bottom part was exactly like a dolphin with a double fin at the end, but from the navel up it looked as human as any person you'd meet on the street. But the features were coarse, it had a long pointed nose, and a sort of a pinkish red sort of complexion. And the local people told him that these mer beings travelled in schools and were very frightened of contact with humans. And when a boat approached them, they would signal to each other and then dive to great depths. And that they used their hands, which had 4 fingers and the thumb, to drag themselves up onto the beach at night. And these Morotai Islanders regarded them as just part of their natural environment, something they would kill and eat as food. And so, what this tends to show then, remarkably enough, and I was too astounded to believe it for a moment to begin with, was that these mermaids may have once existed, perhaps they still do, and that they are actually a species of aquatic primate.
Well, Lauren Coleman, he thinks that there are species of marine primates around the world. In fact, he says that the chupacabras is some form of marine primate too.
Yes, that's correct. I was looking at a picture of the Jersey Devil.
Yes.
That was originally drawn in, I think, 1924, and it actually showed an animal similar to that, but with webbed feet. And that's right, I have read that Patrick Coleman believes that they're a group of aquatic apes. And, at first that sounds amazing, but these things have been seen, and I'm referring once again to Lauren Coleman's book, Field Guide to Bigfoot Yeti and Other Mystery Primates. These similar animals have been observed even in Madagascar, and of course North and South America, mainly South America.
Well, we also have a creature around here that is called the Bunyip. Is there any chance that the Bunyip could be a marine primate, because it's seen in a lot of waterholes? Now the Bunyip can be confused with the Yowie, because, and some of the Bunyips were definitely Yowies, because these animals, whether they're Homo erectus or whether they're Gigantopithecus, there's very good evidence that they can swim. I know that one of the most experienced Sasquatch researchers in British Columbia found evidence that they were swimming from island to island
this is in the open ocean, and he found the footprints on the beaches, and he actually observed them climbing up mountain ranges on these islands. These aren't small islands, fairly largish islands, I guess.
Have we had one of those sorts of sightings on Phillip Island in Victoria?
Yes, that's right. There was a very early report on Phillip Island, and the description of it was a sort of an animal they described as a baboon-like creature that dived into the water. And I can't quite remember now if it had a fish-like tail, but the Murray River people, the Aboriginal people of the Murray River,
yes,
they have a Bunyip tradition, and they've drawn that from what I remember. I think it might be in Out of the Shadows by Tony Healy and Paul Cropper. I can't quite remember. I think it's in that book. And that shows a very yowie-like animal in the water. And I was once listening to Tim the Yowie Man on...
oh yes, Crypto-Naturalist.
Crypto-Naturalist, on Triple J radio station, and he was asking people to phone in if they'd seen anything unusual. And a very interesting reports came in from people. One fellow was talking about how he was swimming in the river with friends near Wagga Wagga in New South Wales, and his friends left early, and he decided he'd stay there. He had no reason to hurry off, and he swam, and then he enjoyed himself. He finally climbed back out very late in the afternoon, and he said he was astounded to see an animal which reminded him of something halfway between a wombat and an ape or something, a big sort of hairy animal that was squatting and seemed to be defecating. He ran for his life. He was quite horrified. There have been some of the yowie reports definitely sound like swimming yowies, but generally the true bunyip appears to have been a herbivore and a very interesting animal. It's very possibly a species that we know of as the marsupial tapir, Palakestes aziel.
Is this a remnant of megafauna?
That's correct. That was apparently one of the last of the joint relatives of the koala and wombat, one of the diprotodontids, and Australia, up until, I don't know, maybe 20,000 years ago, we're not quite sure, was dominated by a whole array of giant koalas, or relatives of the koalas. They were like giant koalas as big as hippos and rhinos. Many of these are giant kangaroos.
Wasn't there even like a marsupial lion type creature as well?
That's right, marsupial lions that were once again related to koalas and possums. And of course the Tasmanian tiger or thylacine all over Australia, Tasmanian devils all over Australia. And the Palakestes was apparently one of the last survivors because it was illustrated in cave paintings in Arnhem Land. And it's a very unusual animal. It had a small trunk like a tapir or a very shortened version of an elephant's trunk.
Sure, I understand what you're saying.
And it was the size. It was described as being the size of a bull or horse. It was a quadrupedal animal. It was on all four legs. It was higher at the front and lower at the back. It had a bit of a tail that was a bit almost horse-like, shaggy sort of a tail. It was covered in fur. And the most interesting thing is that it had very large claws. This is a herbivore. It had very large claws, and its elbows were fixed so that it could not move around like walking in a normal way. And it had these giant claws that prevented it from walking around on the ground. Now, this is a thing the size of a horse or a tapir.
Gee.
Or a calf, that sort of size range. And so, due to his paleontological descriptions of it standing there ripping bark off trees and stuff. It doesn't sound like much of a diet to me. And it was obviously too big to hang from the trees. And the descriptions of the Aboriginal people in the Victorian and southern New South Wales localities of an aquatic animal seem to resemble most closely this Palacestis aziel or marsupial tapir. And I think that it may have been an aquatic species, and that, of course, before we destroyed the entire ecosystems in Australia, the place was covered in ancient forests. The rivers were clear and deep and full of giant trees lying everywhere, full of giant Murray cod and everything. And I would be surprised if these things, these bunyips, use their big claws and immovable elbows to hold themselves steady on logs and what have you in the water, while they'll be feeding with their trunk on the water reeds and grasses and moving out onto the ground, soft ground, where they were observed by Europeans, and always rushing back into the water at the slightest disturbance. And so, and howling. They had a sort of a roaring call. And remember, the Aboriginal people and the early settlers, European settlers, of course, were well and truly in tune with the bushland. I mean, even the early settlers had to often hunt their food, and so would be well and truly aware of all the different bird calls and animal calls, and they were very certain that the calls of the bunyip were of some other animal altogether unknown. But some of the bunyips may have also been seals. Other animals described as bunyips sounded like they're very much like seals, and had been recorded hundreds and sometimes even thousands of kilometres up rivers, up the Murray River, and they were seen. One was shot in western New South Wales and stuffed and mounted in a museum, and it was a seal, a saltwater seal that had swum all the way up the Murray River and the Darling River. And I think a group of them were once seen during a flood near Gundagai. So seals were on many occasions observed and even sometimes shot way upstream. And even a leopard seal, which is an Antarctic species but which moves up the coastline and have often been washed ashore alive and have been kept for many years at Taronga Zoo in Sydney. And in the Shoalhaven River, a sea leopard was shot and it had a platypus in its belly.
Gee.
So some of these sightings of bunyips very likely due to the observations of seals way up in the fresh water.
Well, we've certainly got some surprising animals and animal behaviour in our own backyard.
Oh yes, yeah. It's one of the more interesting things about the natural habitats and about the Australian environment, because the Australian ecosystems are in a state of rapid collapse. There's been so much clearing that's going on that there's a great wave of extinctions happening now. We're losing our wildlife very, very rapidly, and I myself have noticed it over the years, and other people that are interested in the natural environment, bird watchers and stuff, usually say the same thing to me. They're not seeing the species that they used to see.
Yeah. I know that Grover Krantz, the Bigfoot expert in the US, was quite adamant that in order to conserve the remaining population of, creatures such as the Sasquatch, you have to shoot one to prove it's real, or they'll cease to exist without anyone really knowing about them. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, yeah, you really do need physical evidence to prove that these things exist. I don't think it's possible to shoot one because no one's been able to shoot one previously, even in America where everyone's armed to the teeth. And so I don't think, I think it's very unlikely that we're ever even going to find a specimen unless by extreme good fortune. As you wander around in the bush, you don't often find dead animals lying about, even though there's plenty of animal life around, because the carcass will quickly be eaten.
I heard a really interesting statistic, and you can tell me your thoughts on this one, that a grizzly bear, a dead one in its natural environment, has never been found.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think there you go. One has to rest their case with that. That's a perfect example. One of the things people say as well, if they exist, surely we would find dead ones.
Well, that's the argument, yeah, with the Sasquatch in America's northwest.
Yeah, so because we see an animal, I mean, the place is full of kangaroos, but you don't often see kangaroo skeletons or anything lying around. The body is rapidly decomposed and eaten by blowflies and what have you.
Nature cleans up its plate pretty quickly.
That's right, and then the vegetation grows, and so the bones and stuff are lying there. The leaf litter is falling down on it. You'd be very fortunate to be able to find a specimen. I myself have always been surprised. I mean, to begin with, I thought that there was no chance of anything like this living in Australia, because I thought, well, we would have found evidence of them in caves. Surely we would have picked up a tooth somewhere, because the teeth survive better than anything else. And some of the species, Gigantopithecus, for instance, we know existed, a giant gorilla-like animal in Asia.
Well, the only thing that's even been found of a Gigantopithecus is a bit of a jawbone and some teeth.
That's correct, yes. And so for all the millions of Gigantopithecus that must have existed
Indeed.
over millions of years, we've got virtually no evidence that they existed at all.
Well, Gary, I really hope that you see a cryptid very, very soon, whether it be a thylacine or a yowie or a bunyip.
Yes, well, what's been happening here in my area is that we've been getting a great number of reports of an animal that it could be a thylacine, perhaps it's even Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion.
Right.
But it's a very cat-like animal, but the people that see it, and I've had virtually now 50 to 60 sightings, people reported these things to me on rare occasions on my wildlife talkback program, and because I don't discourage people, because I know others will, they'll say, oh, don't be ridiculous, it possibly exists, it's an impossibility, but I mean, that's basically then calling those people a liar, and I find that the people that have reported these things to me, both the yowies or this other animal,
really credible witnesses.
You're sure it's not a fox? They go, oh, it's definitely not a fox, and it's a largish animal. It's got pale stripes. It's almost like a more cat-like version of the Tasmanian tiger or thylacine. It's got stripes, but the stripes are very pale, so mostly the animal looks a sort of a fairly golden colour. But often they see bands on the tail, and I saw that animal myself
Wow.
10 years ago. In about 1969, I got a very close look at it, crossing the road between Brisbane and the Gold Coast, and I've even got a drawing of it, and I couldn't identify that animal. It had a very distinctive waddle to it. The hindquarters were waddling a bit like a possum, I think a brush-tailed possum walking across the ground. The hindquarters moved very much like that. It had a straight, long, banded tail, fairly thickly furred, an animal about the size of a good-sized dog, 60, 70 centimetres in height, say, and the tail as long as the animal. And I got a very close look at it, and rounded ears, distinct rounded ears, distinctly separated on the head, and...
Well, it's certainly consistent of some of the bones that have been found from the Thylacoleo.
Yes, that's right, the marsupial lion. The only remarkable thing is, but no one's probably got close enough, if it is Thylacoleo, that animal, which is supposed to be extinct for many thousands of years...
Well, megafauna, yeah.
Has very distinct cutting molars on either side of its jaws. It is gigantuous molars, and it doesn't have any canines because it's not it's not part of the carnivorous marsupials, for instance. It's actually related to the diprotodontid or herbivorous marsupials. And this animal killed with huge incisors with its front teeth. So it didn't have big canines or fangs. It had tusks in the front of the mouth, and it had climbing digits or claws, and it had a huge killing thumbnail, which it used to grasp onto the body of its prey, and it would no doubt then grip the throat of the animal and cut the blood supply off to the head or whatever, very much like the big cats do. The marsupial lion would have a pouch, and the footprints that I've seen photographs of footprints, and they do indeed look very much like this marsupial lion.
It just goes to show that people should really look out carefully when they're driving at night and what they should see crossing the road. I mean, they could see a thylacine or even a marsupial lion.
Yeah, it's very possible. I've had reports of lots of people who worked in the bushland for years and saw dingoes regularly, etc., and foxes, and very familiar with all the wildlife. And then on one particular occasion, they'll suddenly see something completely out of the ordinary cross their path, and they'll remember it from then on as one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And it's always been a very disturbing thing for people because it's completely unlike anything they've seen before, and they're generally pretty aware of what lives in the bush, and it always amazes them.
Well, that's just the beauty of cryptozoology, isn't it, really, Gary?
Yes, the pursuit of the natural environment, understanding humanity and our natural habitat, because the bushland that we protect in national parks and state forests, what have you, it's just not the habitat of little cute cuddlies and creepy crawlies and things. It's all actually our habitat. It's part of the life support systems that keep the planet alive and moderate the climate and everything else. And to have an interest in the natural environment is a very healthy sort of pursuit, and it makes it particularly interesting that there's fascinating mysteries that are much more interesting than the fictional detective mysteries, crime mysteries that saturate our TVs.
Absolutely.
We've got these amazing mysteries happening in our own backyards if we only go out and look for them.
Gary, thank you so much for sharing with us today some of your experiences out in the wilderness. It's been really wonderful talking with you.
And I most enjoyed talking with you.
You're listening to Ghost Radio.
Did you know that? Ghost Radio